I'm pleased to welcome John Pfordresher to Politics and Prose. John's book, The Secret History of Jane Eyre, functions as a richly detailed and poignant biography of Brontë the writer, Jane Eyre the character, and Jane Eyre the masterpiece. It makes an argument for Jane Eyre as a Brontë autobiography, detailing the links between her private life and her most well-known creation. Describing a review in the Wall Street Journal as a widely readable introduction to the novel and author, The Secret History also offers ample insights for Brontë aficionados and invites readers to grapple with the issue of literary authenticity. John Pfordresher is local. He is a professor of English with a particular interest in 19th century literature. He teaches at Georgetown University. If you could please join me in welcoming John to Politics and Prose.
I'm really grateful to Politics and Prose. As soon as they heard about this book appearing, they got in touch with a publicity guy at Norton and said, could John come and join us? That was the first institution to ask me to talk, so it was really great that they put their trust in me, so I'm very grateful for that. I'm hugely grateful for all of you to be here tonight. It's really touching. There are people here who were, if I can use the word, my students, my colleagues in Smithsonian Institution lectures that I gave many, many years ago. There are students here. One of them introduced herself to me as being in a Dickens class I taught in 1978. And there are people with whom I have worked in the Georgetown Villa in Florence, and with whom I have this memory of times in Italy that we shared together. So all kinds of wonderful connections, neighbors, friends, people from my building back in darkest Northern Virginia. So thank you all for coming. Despite the threat of Jane Eyre-style thunderstorms, heat waves, and everything else. Yeah, it reminds one of Rochester going crazy on this tropical island and thinking it's like hell. Well, sometimes it is a little bit like hell here. But thank you all for coming. I wanted to thank Politics and Prose and you, and I want to thank my wife, who's in the first row here, for whom the book is dedicated and who had to put up with a hell of a lot as I was writing it. Yes, that's right. There's a touching story, at least touching to me, a touching story about how this book got started. I was very lucky to be invited 4 times by Diane Rehm to participate in one of her readers' sessions, And in one of them, we talked about Jane Eyre. That was, it turns out, the 27th of April, 2011. A couple of years later, I got a cold email from a literary agent saying to me, well, Jane Eyre's my favorite book. Would you like to write a book about how Charlotte Brontë wrote the book that I like so much? I thought that was a really interesting question. It was interesting to me. So she and I worked together. She's here tonight, but of course, she's only here in a secret form so that you won't know who she is or where she is, because she prefers, like Charlotte Brontë, to maintain her secrecy. We submitted a book proposal to Norton in the fall of 2014, and then I was working on the book pretty much since then. And it went through 2 drafts, and it's good that it did because it's much the better for the second draft. So a fair amount of work was put into it. So I want to start talking about secrecy, and I want to talk about Jane Eyre. It has this flashy title, The Secret History. Charlotte Brontë had 3 strong reasons to want to keep her relationship to this book a secret. And all have to do with the crisis that her life was going into in the middle of the 1840s. The most immediate crisis was that her father, who was a Church of England clergyman, was suffering progressive loss of sight because of cataracts of the eye, and had to have an operation, which, as you can imagine, was a lot of fun. No anesthesia, just lying there with a guy dug into his eyeball with whatever. That was in August of 1846. Not something that she wanted to trumpet, widely, he was the sole means of support for this cluster of genius writers, Emily, Anne, and Branwell, as well as Charlotte, none of whom could hold down a decent job for more than a couple of months. And therefore, his mounting blindness promised, if it continued, to mean he would lose his job, he would lose his rectory, he would lose his income, and they would all be in a terrible situation. So this was a real crisis. Then there are two others. Charlotte, of course, from the time she was a young woman, understood that she was a writer of genius. She and Branwell had been writing together since their early adolescence. In endeavoring to be the oldest surviving sister who could help with the family, she had engineered, and she was the one who did all the preparations, first the publication of a book of poems by herself and her two sisters, and then tried to get novels by all three published. And the book of poetry sold 2 copies, so that wasn't a big success. Her novel, which she originally titled The Master, it's a very important word in Jane Eyre, as you know, The Master, and later on The Professor, got no interest at all when she sent it to, I think, 6 different publishers. So here's another aspect of her life, yearning to be a famous writer, failing to be a famous writer, that she didn't want to tell anybody about. And of course, I think everybody in the room knows that when Emily first discovered that Charlotte was putting together this book of poetry, Emily was furious. She felt as though her personal privacy was being violated in a way that was almost intolerable. And so the 3 sisters, as everybody knows, agreed to publish those books, that book under pseudonyms. And the first novels all came out under pseudonyms as well. Currer Bell is Charlotte's. Third secret, the most private and the most troubling to Charlotte, is that she had been to Brussels 1842 to 1843 to study French, and Emily had been with her. They had studied in a school for girls, and she had fallen madly in love with her French teacher, a man who was, as Rochester points out to Jane Eyre, could be old enough to be her father. Maybe not quite that for Monsieur Heger, but almost. She left the school in Brussels at the end of 1843 and started writing letters back to him. 4 of them survive. They are passionate love letters with no holds barred about how tormented she is by the fact that she's not with him and that she needs to return to Brussels to be with him because that's the only thing that matters to her in life. So this is not something to be trumpeted around, particularly since he was married and he and his wife had 6 children. So he was acutely, we can tell, even though his replies to her letters do not survive, we can tell that he was trying to deal with this brilliant, difficult, highly emotional woman who was sending him letters from Haworth in Yorkshire and telling him that she couldn't live without him. What was he to do? Trying to damp her down. The last surviving letter by Charlotte was written in November of 1845 and raises the question of what am I going to do because you're not even answering my letters now. 9 months later, she started writing Jane Eyre. It is self-evidently a love letter sent to Monsieur Heger. That Jane Eyre, the character, and Mr. Rochester, who is, of course, her famous love, are Charlotte and Heger. And as you get to know how she imagined him and how she imagined herself, it's unescapable that the whole book is, in a sense, her effort to address him in terms of her passion for him, but a passion that she wishes to assert because of the independence of herself as a woman, right? That she has a right to feel this way. She has a right to want to tell him how she cares about him. And this is finally the last way that she was able to achieve that. The big and radical change for Charlotte Brontë in writing this novel was the adoption of a new voice. Her previous fiction that she'd written in collaboration with her brother and her first novel, The Professor, were all in the voice of a male narrator. So suddenly writing a whole big novel from the voice of a woman was for her something utterly new. And it wasn't terribly common generally in British letters. Daniel Defoe had written Moll Flanders back in the early 1700s. There's no evidence that Charlotte had read Moll Flanders. She had read Samuel Richardson's Sir Charles Grandison, a long, well, I've never read it, epistolary novel with a number of the figures in the novel who were women writing letters. And she makes extensive discussion of that book in a letter. So we know she knows Richardson. But what really matters, and I can tell you guys are here because you care about this writer, something that you might enjoy pursuing in the future. What really mattered to her as she was creating this voice was an enormous number of letters that she wrote to her dear friend Ellen Nussey, N-U-S-S-E-Y. They had met in their adolescence at the Roehead School for Girls. They remained lifelong friends. I think Ellen claimed to have preserved 500 of Charlotte's letters. I don't think all of them have survived, but lots of them did. And in Margaret Smith's edition of Charlotte's letters, you see, as Charlotte writes to Ellen Nussey, the voice of Jane Eyre, as it were, evolving and developing. So that by the time she picked up her pen in August of 1846, she was ready to write this book. She picked up her pen in rented rooms in Manchester the day after her father had the operation for his cataracts. And he was in a darkened room next to her, She faced 3 weeks of his recuperation, and that's when the book started. And you can see how all of this that I've been mentioning the last couple of minutes comes together, right? The baffled love, the sense of being a failure as a writer, the dramatic need to somehow save the family, with her pen. It was a moment, it seems to me, of extraordinary bravery and self-confidence. I mean, the whole record suggested she was a failure as a writer, and yet here she is picking up her pen. And so it's an extraordinary moment. How did she write? I have to watch my watch so that I don't go. Time is good. The time is good so far. How did she work? She received a letter from a man named G.E. Lewes, L-E-W-E-S. Lewes was, several years later, to become the life partner of Mary Ann Evans, whose pen name was George Eliot. He had published already a novel named Ranthorpe, and he had been commissioned to write a review of Jane Eyre. His letter to her is lost, but we know that he wrote to her warning her not to be too melodramatic as a writer. Her book had been published. It was already a bestseller. Nevertheless, this really touched her. Something about what he was saying touched her. And so in response, she told him how she had started to write and then how the writing changed. She said to him in this letter, this is 6th of November, 1847, she began wanting to have nature and truth as my sole guides. So she was after writing a realistic novel, nature and truth. And in this book, to which I have a connection, I used as an epigraph a phrase that is so much at the core of both Charlotte Brontë and Jane Eyre. How dare I? Because it's the truth. Truth italicized. So that's the way she started. She wanted to write, she told Lewes, a book that would be soft, grave, and true. Wonderful string of words, it seems to me. And then she confesses, if I'm going to write a whole novel that's just out of my experience, one of the problems is going to emerge is it's going to be too egotistical. It's going to be too single-voiced. It's not going to be interesting after a while. It's just going to be me, me, me. And so in the last paragraph, she says, there is something else that began to become a part of the creative process, and that is the imagination. And she says, the imagination shows us bright pictures. Are we never to look at them and try to reproduce them? And of course the answer is, nope, we're going to reproduce them. So that the work of the writing of this book became a weave of things that Charlotte Brontë had experienced, sometimes very painfully experienced, and knew what she would call the truth. But then also another kind of truth, which is the truth of imagination, desire, those bright pictures. And I'm not going to read from my book, but I want to read you a paragraph from hers, because it really is really important. This paragraph is one page before the description of Jane Eyre first encountering Mr. Rochester. It's as if Charlotte Brontë is getting ready for that big scene and trying to explain to herself and her readers how she can justify that scene. It's a great scene, I think we all agree, one of the terrific moments in Victorian fiction. So this is Charlotte and Jane. It is in vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action. And they will make it if they cannot find it. And then she begins to widen the frame of this claim in something that for the 1840s is very important. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine, and millions are in silent revolt against their lot. Nobody knows how many rebellions, besides political rebellions, ferment in the masses of life which people earth. And then an important turn. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. And as I said a moment ago, it seems to me clear, Brontë is sitting there at her desk and she's thinking, I'm about to write about what I desire. I'm going to begin to make up scenes which are going to be how I imagine love and how I imagine a man I could love. And don't try and tie me down. I'm not going to be making pudding anymore, right? I am going to put it out there just as it has lived for me as those bright images. Needless to say, the early critics, the people who didn't like Jane Eyre, attacked the book as unfeminine. Appears in the book reviews, and Charlotte had anticipated this. She puts that same word into the mouth of St. John Rivers, the enthusiastic clergyman who wants her to join him in India and die for the sake of his own notions of his calling in life. I want to get right. Unfeminine. Another review attacked the masculine hardness, coarseness, and freedom of expression found in this. Of course, we like it, right? That's precisely why we like it. And behind all of this, it's very clear. And behind the resistance to the voice that speaks Jane Eyre is the fact that Jane Eyre is constantly choosing and judging. This is good, this is bad. I like this person, I don't like that person. And that was regarded as illegitimate, right? She was just supposed to be sweet. And so the people who had that notion of how you were to be a woman were infuriated by that freedom of mind, that freedom of judgment, which Charlotte Brontë is exercising and Jane Eyre is exercising on every page. Now, I want to talk for a couple of minutes about just some examples of how what I'm calling, in my funny way, secret history. I want to ask that we look just for a couple of minutes at a particular scene very early in the book, a scene that will be familiar, I think, to everybody in the room. It's a scene where Jane Eyre, aged 10 years old, attacks her mother. Now, I know it's her stepmother. It's not really her mother. Her mother is dead. But the woman is in the position of being a mother. And in fact, one might argue, given the value system of the 19th century, that the fact that this is a stepmother, a person who has extended herself to take care of the orphan, deserves even more respect than the actual mother. But let's just say it's mother beating and leave it at that. Mrs. Reed says to Jane Eyre and to her children, because Jane Eyre has come to seem nothing but a troublemaker after she fights off John Reed, Mrs. Reed says to the kids, she's not worthy of notice. Stay away from her. She's not worthy of notice. And this really pushes a button in Jane Eyre. And her response is to shout loudly, they are not fit to associate with me. And then she says, speaking of Mrs. Reed's dead husband, what would Uncle Reed say to you if he were alive? Sort of heaping on the guilt. And the older Jane Eyre, looking back on this moment, writes, something spoke out of me, over which I had no control. And as she looks at Mrs. Reed, she sees in her eyes that Jane Eyre, she really did not know whether I were a child or a fiend. So there's that confrontation. Then, of course, Mrs. Reed goes away, and Jane Eyre is immediately beginning to feel guilty, and I shouldn't have talked that way, and all the things that she'd been trained in from the time she was a kid. So we can ask ourselves, where does this scene come from? First of all, there's absolutely no evidence that the childhood of the surviving Brontë children was like Jane Eyre's childhood with the Reeds. There is no evidence that I know of that, for example, the father, Patrick Brontë, ever was harsh or difficult in raising the kids. He was a difficult man, but he seems to have been a tender father. And we ought to remember he tutored all of them individually until they were adolescents and finally went away to conventional schools. There's an exception to that, but put that aside for the moment. He was a tender father. He had high esteem for the intelligence of his children. He wasn't Mrs. Reed. So we ask, where does she come from? And the answer sort of clicks into focus almost immediately. In the summer of 1839, when Charlotte Brontë was 23 years old, she had her first gig as a governess. And we all know what fun it was to be a Victorian governess, right? The Brontës, Anne and Charlotte and Emily, made very clear that it was no fun at all. The governess was expected to be of the same social class as the family, but not to have any money. So she, on the one hand, was genteel, and on the other hand, was expected to just keep quiet and work all day long, right? Charlotte Brontë finds herself in the home of a newly rich bourgeois family, and the lady of the house is like a good mid-Victorian factory owner. She wants to get 10 to 12 hours of work out of her every day, and that's it. It drove Charlotte Brontë furious, as she said in a letter to I think this is to Emily. Speaking of Mrs. Sidgwick, She doesn't know my character, and she doesn't wish to know it. I've never had 5 minutes of conversation with her since I came, except when she was scolding me. And the minute you read these passages from her letters, you understand that this is how Brontë is working as an artist. She has not lost her indignation and her anger at Mrs. Sidgwick. She transports that anger from her own experience, age 23, back to her character, age 10 years old, assaulting Mrs. Reed. Does that make sense? And all of Bronte's indignation at simply not being treated as somebody you would talk to, give a civil word or two to, is there in the encounter between little Jane Eyre and Mrs. Reed. And then Mrs. Reed gets blamed for sending Jane Eyre to this horrible school, Lowood, in which Jane Eyre is abused, and in which she meets a wonderful friend who reads Samuel Johnson, and who dies of tuberculosis. And who is that? It's her older sister, Maria, who went to the same school and died of the same disease. And what is so touching about the page in which Jane Eyre crawls into the bed of the dying Helen Burns and is actually comforted by Helen Burns, falls asleep in her arms, wakes up the next morning to find Helen dead, is Bronte's reconciliation with her lost sister. Her imagination has brought back a brighter picture of the end of her sister's life than the truth, but it has a kind of emotional validity, a kind of truth in that sense, which Bronte's novel wants to affirm. So I'm out of time, and thank you for your attentiveness. Our format now goes this way. We have 2 microphones, and we're going to ask if people would like to say something or question something, please come forward. I will try to sort of repeat the question so that everybody gets it. And thanks to the people who want to do it. Hi, Tom.
Should I go?
Please.
In the preface to the second edition, there's this completely, to my mind, over-the-top tribute to Thackeray. She didn't know Thackeray at that time, right? Did she ever get to know him, and are there any secrets involved in all of that?
It's a very, very interesting question, isn't it? She just a couple things to say about that, and I'll try to repress myself from saying too much. She introduced herself to her publishers in August of 48 because a rogue publisher was suggesting that he had more books by Charlotte Brontë that he was going to publish. And if any of you saw that wonderful BBC TV show of a couple of months ago, Forgotten Women or something, I don't know the title. Does anybody remember the title? What was the title? Silent Women, or yeah. It's a great scene in that film. They just walked in, Anne and Charlotte, of a Saturday morning, and said hi. Charlotte said hi. I'm Currer, and I wrote the book. And of course, all the people in the office are men, and they're all shocked and astonished and thrilled. And so then they said, "Oh, we're going to introduce you to everybody we know." And she said, "Oh no, I want to maintain the pseudonym. I want to maintain the secret," right? She was introduced to Thackeray in social settings, and and then he did something which says a lot about Charlotte Brontë. He gives a lecture. This is, let's see if I can get the date correct for us, and maybe I can't. I won't try now. I think it's 51. He finishes his lecture and he shouts, Thackeray, a very endearing personality, I think, in a lot of ways, "Mother, I want you to meet Jane Eyre." The next day, George Smith finds the two of them, and Charlotte is yelling at Thackeray, and she comes up to his elbow. She's so little. And George Smith writes in his letter, he says, it was like watching somebody lobbing shells into a fortification, because she was so angry that he had sort of broken her secrecy. What mattered to her about Vanity Fair was that she judged that it was a brilliant satire against the flaws of their day, and she admired that courage. Another, please.
So you mentioned that Mr. Rochester was her French teacher.
In part.
In part, but he goes blind like her dad is going blind.
Yes, he does, and that's very important, isn't it? So Rochester, because of the burning down of Thornfield, loses one eye and is blinded in the other. One of the great complications I think, for Charlotte Brontë about how to end the book, this is argued in my discussion of the book. Charlotte Brontë was really happy living with her sisters independently. And so when we see Diana and Mary Rivers and Jane Eyre living in Marsh End, baking, reading German, taking walks on the moors, for Charlotte Brontë, this seemed to be the happiest possible way for her to live. And yet she had to somehow bring Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre back again. So as I think we all know, first of all, Rochester is punished. He's fiery, he's rule-breaking, and so he has to be singed and have lose an arm and an eye. And then he becomes very like her dad. He becomes, for example, very religious. He's making allusions to God's mercy, to my faults, right? And she rescues him from that blindness and from his solitude. Yeah. My book argues that Patrick Brontë is, I think there's 5 men, all sort of in Rochester. It's her dad, her brother, with whom she had this complex and evolving relationship, a fictive character, Zamora, that she and her brother had invented, Monsieur Heger, and who's the last one? I've already forgotten, but at least 5 different influences are all woven together in order to make Mr. Rochester. Please.
You say that there are 5...
Just turn it down because maybe I'll remember the 5th.
You said that there are 5 letters
No.
that Charlotte, very passionate letters that Charlotte wrote to Monsieur Heger. How did you find them?
The letter, it's a very, very interesting and important question. Her letters to him survived, and they were given to the British Library early in the 20th century by his descendants. All 4 letters had been torn apart and then had been mended by stitching and gumming and so on to reconstitute them. And Winifred Guerin's explanation for this I find very persuasive. She thinks his wife put the letters back together, and she thinks that the wife did it in order to show anybody who might want to raise the question that her husband wasn't messing around with the girls, even when they sent letters like this to him. Yeah. They're extraordinary to read. All the fiery energy of Brontë as a prose stylist is in those letters. They're really something. Maybe somebody will remember my 5th person. Patrick? No, it isn't Luz. Patrick? It was actually the character in her book, The Master. That's the 5th. Her fictive character. Yes, John?
Yes, you go from Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gateskill, who are very different authors. You have a 20-year layoff, and the Brontes emerge, and they have no real followers. Why? Why do these 2 women basically create romantic novels well after the romantic period of poetry? And it seems a dead end in English fiction for at least 60 years. Is there a reason for this?
Let's see. Anybody have it? Because I'm a little scared of your generalization there. I love your generalizations, John, but I really can't answer that except to say that I don't know of, as a teacher, I'm always looking for new books to offer to my classes. And for years I was an author on high school literature books. So I was always looking for somebody else, And I don't know of anybody who's like the Brontes. Absolutely don't know. There really is no school. No. They're inimitable in a way. In a sense, I think almost Emily is more extraordinarily unique than Charlotte. Now, in the 20th century, I think there's a surge of people, of writers, many writers, who want to sort of pick up.
Well, as feminism picks up, so do the writers.
Yeah, no, right, they can't hear you, so yeah, okay, all right. Other questions? No? And I'm not watching the time again. Are we good? Oh, yes, please. I think what's beautiful about us together right now is that we've all come because we love this book. And I'm not talking about mine.
We know that analyzing Jane Eyre and Lucy Snow,
Yeah.
we see all the features of feminine trauma, female trauma, embodied in characters who have a tremendous amount of agency over their lives, as opposed to, that they're not patients. They combine agency and trauma. And we know that Charlotte knew all about phrenology, and that she was very influenced by phrenology because it comes across in the way she describes Rochester in particular. I'm curious about how much she was aware of the sort of burgeoning and very male understanding of female hysteria and sort of somatic experience, how much of that was weaving in and how much she was pushing back on the idea of the woman, of the hysterical woman, as a sort of social victim.
Such an important question, obviously. My sense is from the writings by her that I've read, the letters, the famous Rowhead Diary, which is a diary she kept when she was teaching at a school for girls. She loved it. She loved her anger. She loved the ways in which she felt a passionate need to break away from where she was and who she was. And if somebody had said to her, this is a form of hysteria, she would have said, and I'm going to just let it rip. A lot of people, and certainly I'm interested in this, are attracted by thinking about Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic, as a close relative of Charlotte Bronte's. And her letters and the Rowhead Diary, biographies of her, make it clear she was given to the sort of anger that we heard about with 10-year-old Jane Eyre, where she really didn't feel any longer fully in control of herself. And my sense is she validated that this was a good thing, even when she seemed to be sort of out of herself. There's a really interesting word, and you'll all remember it. When Mrs. Fairfax is first showing Jane Eyre Thornfield, and they go up to the third floor, and they hear this laugh, And Jane Eyre says, "It thrilled me." Now, I find that a very interesting word. On the one hand, I suppose, made me nervous. The hairs on the back of my head stood up. I also think it's a thrill of kinship. There's somebody like me behind that door. There's somebody who, unless you lock them up, they're really going to be scary. And I try not to push that argument too hard in my discussion. Charlotte was a person that the people who knew her well loved. She was a great friend to her friends. And so she wasn't obnoxiously irascible all the time, but she had a temper. She could be very, very angry.
Hi. You mentioned this a little bit before. I took a course in which the professor proposed that Mr. Rochester and Heathcliff as well were both Branwell. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that complex relationship, even if it only made up a part,
It's
or maybe
very,
anything
very
you found.
important. Very, very important. Yeah. Just a word or two about how the relationship of brother and sister evolved. When they were kids, Charlotte took Branwell to be her favorite sibling. She'd lost the older sisters, Elizabeth and Maria, and Branwell, who was younger than she, became, as you know, I think, the co-author of the Angrian Chronicles. I give some examples in my book of how they love to tease each other. And the teasing between Rochester and Jane Eyre is clearly Branwell. Then, as we all know, he ran off the rails, especially after the thwarted love affair with the clergyman's daughter, clergyman's wife, and he entered into that course of self-destruction, heavy drinking, almost certainly taking opium, and announcing to all in kindred that he was already an old man, that he was dying, and he didn't care, right? Charlotte absolutely refused to accept that, and she became steely cold to her brother. She just wasn't going to be sympathetic. She wasn't going to help him. She was really angry with him. There are moments maybe when Mr. Rochester is also the object of Jane Eyre's anger. She is, especially when he announces she's his houri, and he's going to make a seraglio just for her. You'll remember those passages, and she would have none of that. Does that help?
Yeah, thank
you. I think. How are we doing? We're good on time. Anybody else want to?
John?
Oh yes, please, Jer.
Two characters. I don't know if you have said something. My memory isn't what it was. I don't know if you've already said something about where St. John came from. And the other one I'm interested in is Grace Poole, who is a very unusual character, but sort of disappears later on.
I just swallowed wrong, so it's going to be exciting for a minute. St. John is an extremely interesting problem in this regard. The social structure that the Brontë sisters all found themselves born into was a very, very small circle of clergymen and their families. And in these rural English parishes, and actually small urban English parishes, there was a resident priest, and then usually one or more curates who were young men just out of their training, and they were waiting for their own residency. It was assumed that the oldest living daughter in any clergyman's household was eager to marry a curate. That's the way it worked, you know. And the old thing, I said oldest because we're all familiar with notions in the past when the oldest girl gets the first suitor, and then the next girl gets the next suitor, and so on. Charlotte Brontë hated curates. She did, and there's fascinating descriptions in the letters of them as pompous and insensitive and arrogant. Well, I said pompous, arrogant, insensitive towards others, and she relishes rolling out anecdotes where she describes how she embarrasses curates who showed up for tea by firing off angry sentences that they don't know how to deal with. That's in one of the letters to Ellen Nussey. And then there's an extraordinarily revealing letter. And here's how it all works. Ellen Nussey's brother was a clergyman, and he wrote Charlotte a very businesslike letter saying, I'd like to propose marriage. I think you'd be very good at running the Sunday school in my church. And I think we could have a nice life together. And she wrote back and she said, nah, none of that. Thank you very much. She said, if you really knew me well, I'm sarcastic. I'm always making jokes. You would think I was kind of a fantastic, strange sort of a person. And then she writes to her friend Ellen, and this is so characteristic of the woman and, of course, the woman who created Jane Eyre in Rochester. She says, the only man I could fall in love with is a man I could die for. That's my criterion, and nothing less will I accept. And, and then if you know the sad end of her life, well, it's the happy sad end of her life. She had published Villette, still with Currer Bell as the author. She was still maintaining the pseudonym when everybody, I think, in literary England knew that she was the author of these books. The guy who'd been the curate in her father's parish, I think for 9 years, suddenly asked to have a chat with her, just the two of them, and said, I've loved you for 9 years, and I just finally had to tell you. And she told her father, and he was so infuriated, she writes in a letter, the veins in his forehead stood out like whipcords. He wasn't eligible in Patrick Bronte's mind because he wasn't as smart as Charlotte Brontë, and he wasn't eligible because he hadn't negotiated the deal properly. He should have come to Patrick first, you see, and asked, can I present myself to your daughter? And so he did everything to prevent the marriage or the engagement. But Charlotte began to realize, she says in a letter to Ellen, I'm beginning to realize that I'm throwing away one of the most valuable things that somebody can have in their lives, and that is an authentic emotional attachment of one person for another. So they wore down her dad's resistance. They were married in the spring, and this is 54, I think. I'm sorry I'm bad with dates, but you're a clement crowd, huh? They honeymooned in Ireland. He was from the north of Ireland. And then in January, she started to have morning sickness. And almost immediately, uncontrollable morning sickness. She wrote to a friend of hers who had given birth, I don't know if this is how it should be with me, but she says in the letter, I vomit and I vomit until I vomit blood. She couldn't keep anything down. She got thinner and thinner until finally people said of her that her skin seemed to be transparent. She couldn't hold a pencil, and she died. And the child died. And afterwards, her father told one of the servants, I never thought she should have married. She couldn't physically support, she's a little tiny woman, couldn't physically support carrying a child, and she couldn't. One of the sweet things about that relationship, brief as it was, is it made her, well, one aspect of it that was sweet. She was very happy when she was in love with Mr. Nichols. And she had always fantasized that the man in her life would be called the master. It's in the letters, it's in the novels, the master. And in her letters about Mr. Nichols, she calls him repeatedly, my boy. So sweet, you know, that she'd sort of taken him to her heart as my boy. And that's how her life ended. Got nothing on Grace Poole. It's a great question. I just don't know. You see, I tried to cover up just like one of the... You notice how the politicians on TV, they ask them questions which they don't answer? Well, I was trying to... But you wouldn't let me off, Jerry, would you? Are we good now? One more question. And do we? The questions have all been very generous. Thank you, guys. Yes, ma'am. Whoa, boy. I don't. The influence of Jane Eyre on Emily Dickinson. I can't at all. Can anybody help us with that? Did Emily Dickinson read Jane Eyre? Huge.
She was accused of plagiarism.
Wow.
Plagiarizing it. I mean, there were so many passages, and she called her preceptor master.
Yes. So I'm going to echo what you're saying so everybody can hear. Emily Dickinson read Jane Eyre and Brontë more generally. There are passages in the poems that seem to be echoes of the novels, yeah. And she called the man she loved the master, the master. Yeah, yeah. So there it is. Okay, folks. Great. Thank you.